I clipped an item from the July 1973 issue of Psychology Today, which indicates that hair on the face of a man does a great deal more than just itch and provide a haven for germs. My old friend Commander Whitehead of Schweppes will hardly agree with this. Psychologist Robert Pellegrini, reporting in Psychology magazine, has found that men who shave off their facial foliage lose some of their ability to make good first impressions, at least in the eyes of 128 college students. Pellegrini of the California State University at San Jose paid 8 fully bearded young men to shave off their whiskers. And a consultant from a local barber college shaved them down to goatees, then to mustaches, and finally to bare skin. A photographer took pictures of them at all 4 stages, and Pellegrini randomly gave each of the students one photo to judge, so that each picture was rated by 2 males and 2 females. And the results were clear. The more hair a person had, the more he was judged to be masculine, mature, good-looking, self-confident, dominant, courageous, liberal, nonconformist, and industrious. Pellegrini believes that the images associated with bearded men are cultural in origin rather than evolutionary. By that he means that hairy faces are not a fad, but are deeply rooted in our culture. The bearded face has been associated with personalities as diverse as those of Jesus Christ, Sigmund Freud, Abraham Lincoln, Ernest Hemingway, Santa Claus, and Attila the Hun, says Pellegrini. But if we were to characterize the observed pattern by a single personality, it might very well be that of the indomitable Buffalo Bill. Judging from the data in the present research, the male beard communicates an heroic image of the independent, sturdy, and resourceful pioneer, ready, willing, and able to do manly things. He says that it may very well be true that inside every clean-shaven man, there is a beard screaming to be let out. But in my opinion, a hairy face does even more than Dr. Pellegrini suggests. It can also cover a whole lot of otherwise self-image damaging facial characteristics. Few men are endowed with a complete set of handsome features, and the mustache and beard simply cover them up. Facial hair can act as a buffer between a man's self-consciousness about less than ideal facial attributes and the gaze of other human beings. I've often noted that men with beards and mustaches appear quite acceptable, even good-looking, when it's quite obvious under close scrutiny that they would not be nearly so without their natural buffers. This is especially so, I think, when they keep them neatly trimmed. Facial hair has a way of imparting an impression of independence and wisdom as well as manliness when these qualities might otherwise be completely absent. And perhaps the most curious thing of all is that women don't seem to be turned off by all that hair. Kissing a man with a lot of facial hair must be like kissing a ripped horsehair mattress, but they don't seem to mind. But then who understands women anyway? Then, too, a Miami psychiatrist recently reported something that I think most of us have known all along, that the better-looking people, those with unusually attractive or athletic physical attributes, often find life so easy for them in the beginning, they don't prepare themselves to win over the long haul. Beautiful girls find it easier to find jobs, but often experience more difficulty in holding them. And if they let their beauty represent their major way of dealing with the world, when the beauty fades, as alas it must, they're often left defenseless and unable to successfully cope with life. Dr. Greenberg says the star quarterback in college is a campus hero, but when he leaves college, he discovers that life is not a football game. It's the people who have to work hard for what they get who develop the skills to successfully cope with life over the long pull, who tend to make the grade. However, good-looking people usually have a better self-image, and as a result will tackle jobs and take chances their less good-looking peers might hesitate to try. The best bet seems to be good-looking or attractive or very acceptable without being of the sensationally beautiful or handsome variety, and if you're a man, there's always the facial hair to fall back on or forward on. The National Enquirer, that interesting little newspaper with the largest circulation of any paper in the United States, which has gone a long way to prove that news doesn't have to be all bad to sell newspapers, carried a story by Joseph Cassidy that 80% of American workers are unhappy and frustrated with their jobs, according to a research firm's interviews with 250,000 employees from all walks of life. 4 out of every 5 working Americans today are misemployed, said Dr. Herbert M. Greenberg, a Princeton, New Jersey psychologist. They're doing jobs they're not suited for and are thus miserable, added Dr. Greenberg, who is president of Marketing Survey and Research Corporation. These people hate to get up in the morning and go to work. Once on the job, they can't wait to go home. This is a terrible waste to our economy because of staggering losses in productivity, a terrible waste to individual companies since their misplaced employees might be doing a good job in another post, and a terrible waste to the worker himself, who is living an unfulfilled, unhappy life. The real job market tragedy in the United States today is not unemployment, it's misemployment. Dr. Greenberg said he bases his conclusions on interviews that he and his associates have conducted since 1957 with 250,000 employees of 4,000 firms representing every job category and educational group from every part of the country. He says that job frustration is as high at the managerial level as it is at lower levels. You'd think that assembly line workers would be less satisfied than managers, but this just isn't so, he said. Both the blue-collar worker and his boss are caught in jobs they don't like, and both are digging themselves into deeper, more frustrating ruts. People too often stumble into jobs and become caught in a pattern. Relatively few of them ever overcome their accidental beginnings. Instead, they fight their way through to do an adequate job and even succeed to the point where they're considered successful, but who are really very unhappy and who are not living up to their potential. Misemployment is costing American business billions of dollars a year. Among sales forces, for instance, says Dr. Greenberg, 20% of the salesmen sell more than 80% of the products and services. The rest of the salesmen are obviously in the wrong jobs. And take the production line worker who daydreams or plays games on the job to keep his sanity. We have millions of unemployed who would consider a job on that assembly line a tremendous plus. People aren't lazy, he said. If they like their jobs, they'll want to go to work and do a good job. Help a guy find his niche and he'll be a winner. Employers rely too much on what a person's done rather than what his potentials are. American business must scrap this outmoded, typecasting approach to hiring. What's the use of having 20 years' experience if a person is in the wrong job for him? And as for training an employee, training is only effective when you're training the right raw material. In the same issue of the Inquirer, there's a story of two Chicago area bankers who quit their jobs and bought a general store in Alaska. They're not making the money they used to make, but they say they're a lot happier, and so are their families. Now, all the unhappy, unmotivated working people in the country can't open general stores in Alaska, even though a good percentage of them could go into small businesses of their own and learn to live a new lifestyle. But unhappy workers don't necessarily indicate that the basic jobs are wrong. The problem may often lie with faulty motivation and lack of job enrichment. In 1971, a special research study made for members of the President's Association titled Motivation and Effectiveness, and authored by my good friend Frank C. Goebel, was issued, in which Mark Shepard, Jr., president of Texas Instruments, was quoted as saying, "The challenge of increasing human effectiveness is emerging as the remaining frontier offering competitive advantage to the organizations most successful in channeling human talent and energy into constructive outlets. The reservoir is vast, as talent at all levels is poorly utilized." And another friend of mine, consultant Joe Batten, stated that American business is currently overlooking its greatest productive ace in the hole. Literally millions of people are leaving their jobs every evening with much of their energy and productivity still unused. They throw themselves into bowling, little league, baseball, and other activities with a kind of enthusiasm and identification that management has not even tapped. If you're interested in making a study of how to best motivate employees, I suggest you might get a copy of this report. It has an excellent bibliography under references in the back, which would, in my opinion, represent one of the best libraries available on this subject. And another excellent little book I can recommend for guidelines in interpersonal relationships is Why Do You See It That Way? By Michael E. Kolobowski and Lawrence J. Taylor. I've often been struck by the meager libraries of so-called business executives. I guess they believe that managerial and creative talent and know-how is supposed to come to them in dreams, and that they're somehow above the necessity to read the words of others. They're mistaken, and are as often as not holding their jobs because of the shortage of real management talent today. They're often living examples of the Peter Principle. I believe you can judge the reach of a person's mind and capacities as well as his real interests by examining his or her library. I have known so-called experts on various subjects who don't own 10 books on their favorite subject. They just keep saying the same things over and over again, hoping, I suppose, for a fresh audience every time they speak. And I've also found that one of the most unrewarding projects of a top manager who would inspire those below him is to recommend or even loan books. For the most part, they're not read. There's only one way to obtain knowledge, and that is through study. But as Ortega said, studying is for most people like paying income taxes. They'll never do it unless they have to. And it's one of the main reasons that there are 6 to 10 top jobs in every field for every person qualified to handle it. If people aspiring to top management had to go through the kind of training that commercial pilots have to wade through, business failures would be as rare as commercial airplane crashes. In the world of business, the system seems to be to show up for work long enough, don't rock the boat, smile a lot, and time will take care of the rest. In the world of business, you might not be any smarter than you were 10 years ago, but you're there, and when the opening occurs, eventually they've got to put you into it. Once in, a good secretary can keep you there. A good idea would be to provide a bookcase with every junior executive office. Then, from time to time, make the rounds and watch the bookcases. Their growing contents, or the lack of them, will give you an excellent appraisal yardstick for future promotion, or the lack of it. Noting the kind of books would give you an insight into the real interests of the person and help you steer him in the right direction. For example, the books might be on fishing, in which case you could suggest that he go fishing permanently, or apply for a job with a fishing tackle manufacturer. But unless he's buying and reading books on management skills, he's not preparing himself for management. He's just marking time. Like most people aspiring to management positions, he probably feels that management skills come naturally at birth, like a navel or 10 toes. And of course, they don't. And here's something I like very much and found in Lewis Mumford's book, The Transformations of Man. We have arrived at a truism that has so far been forgotten it has the air of a paradox. The need to become human is man's first need, and perhaps it remains his deepest one. Nature provides the materials for this change, but man himself must effect it. In essence, it rests on a constant effort at self-identification, self-affirmation, self-discipline, and self-development. By becoming human, man exchanges the stable natural self native to each biological species for a countless multitude of possible selves, molded for the working out of a special drama and plot that he himself helps to create. In order to effect an ongoing, self-renewing change, we need maintain a constant effort at self-identification, self-affirmation, self-discipline, and self-development. And here's something from the writings of Martin Buber that I found to be one of the most powerful and moving things I've ever read. Man wishes to be confirmed in his being by man, and wishes to have a presence in the being of another. Secretly and bashfully, he watches for a yes, which allows him to be, and which can come to him only from one human person to another. We notice this most with our dealings with children, but it also holds true with every person with whom we have any sort of real contact. We need to be confirmed in our being by others. We wish and need to have a presence in the being of another. And secretly and bashfully we watch for a yes, which allows us to be, and which can come to us only from one human person to another. I thought that was beautiful. Everyone will agree, or at least give lip service, to the concept that he'd like to be a completely free and autonomous person. But we learn from an excellent book by Walter Kaufman entitled Without Guilt and Justice that humanity craves but dreads autonomy. One does not want to live under the yoke of guilt and fear. Autonomy consists of making with open eyes the decisions that give shape to one's life. But being afraid of making fateful decisions, one is tempted to hide autonomy in a metaphysical fog and to become sidetracked and bogged down in puzzles about free will and determinism. It's far easier to define autonomy out of existence than it is to achieve autonomy in the very meaningful sense in which it can be attained. The difference between making the decisions that govern our lives with our eyes open and somehow avoiding this is all important. The best way to begin to understand autonomy is to examine some of the major strategies people use to avoid it. And this I shall do, he writes, and he does brilliantly. In this book, Kaufman examines 10 strategies by which people avoid making the kind of faithful and meaningful decisions about their lives that could transform them into courageous and autonomous persons. He calls those who avoid making such decisions decidophobes, and the condition of avoiding decisions, decidophobia. He points out that people do not fear all decisions. Decidophobes, far from dreading meticulous distinctions, may actually revel in them. for immersion in microscopic decisions is one good way of avoiding fateful decisions. Before getting into the 10 strategies people use to avoid making decisions, he points out that it's easy to understand why parents cultivate acrophobia, the fear of falling, in their children. Precipitous heights are dangerous, and having been taught to dread them, one communicates one's dread to one's children. That's much easier than teaching them prudence, self-reliance, and the skills required to enjoy peaks. All this applies just as much to decidophobia. Anyone making fateful decisions that affect others without feeling any apprehension would be a menace. Anyone who would unhesitatingly plunge into choices that are likely to mold his own character and future would be so unpredictable that he too would endanger the social fabric. The easiest way to ensure stability is to engender fear. Teaching the skills required for responsible decision-making is much harder. Choosing responsibly means that one weighs alternatives. He develops this theme further in his chapter on the new integrity. But comparing faithful alternatives and choosing between them with one's eyes open, fully aware of the risks, is what frightens the decidophobe. Now basically he has 3 options: to avoid fateful decisions, to stack the cards so that one alternative is clearly the right one and there seems to be no risk involved at all, and to decline responsibility. He need not even choose between these options. They can be combined. In brief, avoid if possible. If that does not work, stack. And in any case, make sure that you do not stand alone. It would be reasonable to feel apprehension in direct proportion to the number of those whom our decision is likely to affect importantly. But people tend to attach disproportionate importance to themselves. The decisions they dread most are those that shape their character and their future. He goes on to write, I shall examine 10 strategies that help decidophobes to avoid dizziness. All of them involve the refusal to scrutinize significant alternatives. When anyone shuts his eyes in a crisis, it is plausible to assume that he's afraid. But if he merely acts as if he were afraid, he's still open to criticism. My critique of decidophobia applies also to those who are not afraid, but merely behave as if they were. And he goes on to write, before I consider the 10 strategies, let me comment very briefly on 2 writers who have illuminated decidophobia and one who has not. He then goes into a discussion of Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, and Jean-Paul Sartre, and mentions Sartre's famous declaration in 1943 that man is condemned to be free, suggesting clearly that man finds freedom hard to bear. He points out that in Sartre's philosophy, man is freedom, but always tends to look upon himself as if he were a thing. Thus he succumbs to what Sartre calls mauvaise foi. In my language, this bad faith and these constant self-deceptions are prompted by decidophobia. And after commenting on Erich Fromm's book, Escape from Freedom, and the example of how Hitler achieved complete control of Germany's fate, he examines the 10 strategies most common to decidophobes. In first place, he lists religion, and points out that, as a rule, one does not even decide to submit to the authority of a religion. One is born into the fold and then confirmed at the threshold of adolescence before one has any chance to explore alternatives and make a choice. One does not so much decide to stay as one does not decide to leave. Decidophobia keeps one in the fold. Admitting quite readily that not all religious people are decidophobes, he says that nevertheless religion represents one of the most popular strategies for avoiding the most fateful decisions. In fact, it's nothing less than the classical strategy. Number 2 he lists as drifting. It represents another, even less deliberate strategy, and it comes in 2 forms. Model A is extremely popular with those over 30, without being confined to them. Status quoism. Instead of choosing how to live, with whom, where, what to do, and what to believe, one simply drifts along in the status quo. All decisions are made, none need to be made. Some people need a regular supply of alcohol or tranquilizers to remain satisfied with Model A. This form of inauthenticity is readily perceived by many students, and a few go to the opposite extreme, which is Model B. One drops out, has no ties, and is not guided by tradition. One has no code, no plan, no major purpose. One lives from moment to moment, rarely knowing in advance what one will do next. Model B can also be lubricated with alcohol, but since World War II, this kind of drifting has been associated more often with other drugs. Some of those who have drifted in a Model B are afraid of making almost any decision. If they hitchhike, they go wherever they're taken. They leave things to chance. Everything depends on whatever impulse happens to be felt at the moment. To be governed by caprice is to drift. The hero of Camus' novel, The Stranger, illustrates this orientation. When this way of life breeds a sense of emptiness and despair, one becomes receptive to the siren song of commitment. Allegiance to a movement is the third strategy. Such allegiance, again, is not always decidophobic. Some movements have little bearing on faith and morals, goals, and lifestyles. If so, membership is marginal, although it may still be prompted by a fear of standing alone and some sense that there is safety in numbers. Total immersion, in which no crucial decisions at all remain to be made, is the exception, not the rule. Allegiance to a school of thought comes next, followed by exegetical thinking. Walter Kaufman points out that exegetical thinking assumes that the text that one interprets is right. Thus, the text is treated as an authority. If what it seems to say is wrong, the exegesis must be inadequate. The interpreter is wrong, never the text. Incidentally, I'm just hitting the high spots. He goes into a complete description and evaluation of each strategy as he lists it. The sixth strategy is Manichaeism. The Manichaean insists on the need for a decision, but the choice is loaded and practically makes it so. It's like being asked to choose between two dishes of food and being told that this one is poisoned and will make you sick, while that one tastes incomparably better and will improve your health and expand your consciousness. All good is on one side, all evil on the other. Inconvenient facts are ignored or denied. The falsification of history becomes an indispensable crutch, and uncomfortable arguments are discredited as coming from the forces of evil. There's no need for quandaries that keep men sleepless, and he points out that it's easier to ridicule this strategy than to resist it. The seventh strategy is much the subtlest of the lot, and Kaufman calls it moral rationalism. It claims that purely rational procedures can show what one ought to do or what would constitute a just society. There is then no need at all to choose between different ideals, different societies, different goals. Once again, no room is left for tragic quandaries or fateful choices. He then writes, I have considered 7 ways of avoiding autonomy. 1, religion. 2, drifting. 3, allegiance to a movement. 4, allegiance to a school of thought. 5, exegetical thinking. 6, Manichaeism. And 7, moral rationalism. It is possible to systematize these 7 strategies under 2 headings. First, avoiding fateful decisions, methods 1 to 5. And second, making fateful decisions but stacking the cards in some way so that the choice will make itself and there's no possibility of tragedy. Choices 6 and 7. The 8th strategy for avoiding autonomy is pedantry. It plays a central part in the creeping microscopism mentioned earlier, and I've noted previously, he writes, that as long as one remains absorbed in microscopic distinctions, one is in no great danger of coming face to face with fateful decisions. Of course, careful attention to detail is not only compatible with autonomy, but a requirement of intellectual integrity. Pedantry becomes decidophobic at the point where a person never gets around to considering major decisions with any care and closes his eyes to macroscopic alternatives, and the same criteria apply to all the other strategies. The 9th strategy is the faith that one is riding the wave of the future. This, too, is usually part of a mixed strategy and frequently associated with religion, allegiance to a movement, belonging to a school of thought, or Manichaeism. Those who employ the 9th strategy never stand alone or unsupported. They always feel backed up by force majeure, astrology, oracles, and the Chinese I Ching, which achieved such immense popularity in the United States during the 1960s, have always attracted decidophobes. And the 10th and final strategy is marriage. The 10th strategy, finally, often spells total relief, like the first 2. At first glance, it looks quite different from the others and therefore out of place, but is probably the most popular strategy of all. When getting married, legions of women have echoed Ruth's beautiful words, which in the Bible are not spoken to a husband. Your people shall be my people, your God my God. Henceforth, they agree to make no more fateful decisions. They'll leave that to their husbands. This pattern is deeply ingrained in many cultures. It's what a woman is expected to do when she gets married, and she's expected to get married. Actually, it doesn't always work that way. The man who boasts of making all the big decisions while he leaves the small ones to his wife may admit, when asked to explain, that big decisions concern what we should do about China. Small decisions deal with such matters as buying a house and where to live. Figuratively speaking, many men marry their mothers. It would be wrong to suppose either that marriage must involve decidophobia, or that when it does, only one spouse can have succumbed. This strategy can work for both husband and wife. Often a couple is a committee of two and makes decisions the way committees usually do. A consensus is presumed and not questioned if all goes well. But if things turn out badly, one does not feel altogether responsible. One merely went along. Left to one's own devices, one might have acted quite differently. In a bad marriage, such excuses are stated expressly. In a so-called good marriage, they're entertained privately. However unworthy it may be to harbor such thoughts, there's much more than a grain of truth in them. Left to their own devices, both partners, or on a committee, most or even all members might indeed have made a different decision. As it happened, nobody made any decision at all. And that was one of the main features of the whole arrangement from the start. Marriage is a way of avoiding the necessity of having to make fateful decisions. Instead of making a decision, one talks until something transpires. Another way of putting this point is less nasty and is unassailably true. In marriage, one no longer stands alone. Both partners have somebody to lean on if all goes well. It does require a fateful decision to get married in the first place, but that decision may have been prompted by decidophobia, by the desire to escape loneliness, by an unwillingness to make decisions in solitude. Now, there's nothing paradoxical in that. Kierkegaard's famous leap into commitment is quite typically the plunge one takes from a solitary height to be rid of freedom. It would require a fateful decision to go to a surgeon and say, "Please, doctor, give me a frontal lobotomy." But it would not be in the least paradoxical to say that anyone who made that choice was a decidophobe who had come to the conclusion that he could not take it anymore. Now, believe it or not, the part of the book that I've reviewed here constitutes only a part of the first 30 pages. And it's from here on out that the brilliance of Walter Kaufman shows us how and why we tend to sidestep autonomy, why we tend to tiptoe through life as though we're trying to make it safely to death. I believe every person who has any intention whatsoever of leading anything approaching a life of autonomy and freedom should read and reread this book. Walter Kaufman, born in 1921, came to the United States from Germany in 1939, received his Ph.D. from Harvard in 1947, and has been teaching philosophy at Princeton since that time. He's been a Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar, Fulbright research professor at the University of Heidelberg, Fulbright professor at the Hebrew University, Jerusalem, and visiting professor at Columbia, Cornell, Purdue, Michigan, and Washington universities, and at the New School of Social Research. Somehow I'd managed to miss his earlier books, but I've since ordered several of them. I agree wholeheartedly with Professor John G. Stessinger, who said of this book that it proposes a new and liberating human ethic, that of creative autonomy. The author's argument is intellectually incandescent and logically compelling. The book is bound to become a major landmark in modern philosophy. By all means, read Without Guilt and Justice, From Decidophobia to Autonomy by Walter Kaufman, and add it to the important section of your library. He goes on to describe the autonomous person and lists actual persons whom he thinks have earned that rare and wonderful state. The bibliography at the back of the book will introduce you, as it did me, to many other books you'll want to add to your collection. Success as a human being, and in our work in life, always seems to hinge on the making of big and fateful decisions. How often have you heard someone say, "If only I had done so-and-so when I had the opportunity," or after having finally made a major decision, say, "I should have done this 20 years ago." In Dr. Pearl's book on Gestalt therapy, he recalls that when an opportunity came along for a psychotherapist to take an opening in South Africa, several good men in Germany turned it down. He took it and became quite wealthy and famous as a result, while those who had refused the post ended up in Hitler's death camps. This is not to say that we need jump at every opportunity that beckons, or that we're going to be killed if we don't, but there's a little doubt that we might take a much more adventurous attitude toward life and growth, and look with great care on such opportunities when they present themselves. And this excellent book helps us examine ourselves and decide which, if any of his 10 strategies, have been keeping us in the shallows when we might have sailed into deeper and more interesting seas.